Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're going to get started in just about a minute. Welcome, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Stacy Seltzer, and I am the president of 3G Philly, a group for the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. 3G Philly is honored to be co-partnering this event alongside other 3G groups from across the country: Arizona, Baltimore, Boston, Chicago, DC, Miami, New Jersey, and New York. As 3G groups, we work to preserve the memories and legacy of the Holocaust, honoring our grandparents through peer support, as well as education and advocacy. As a grandchild of Holocaust survivors, I am inspired to be able to share this documentary with our community. Our 3G groups represent one of the last generations to not only have access to and the ability to speak with eyewitness survivors, but to also know them, love them, and share their legacy. We therefore have a unique responsibility. Many of our grandparents have shared their stories with us. Stories of what pre-war Europe looked like and felt like, and of course, their harrowing experiences surviving the war. It is our responsibility collectively to ensure that we never forget and to educate our communities as we sadly watch the rise of anti-Semitism and bigotry worldwide. Hate does not start and end with anti-Semitism. You may or may not know that Jews make up 2.4% of the population, yet 78% of hate crimes are targeted towards Jews. The ADL has been tracking anti-Semitic incidents since 1979. In 3 of the past 5 years, the number of incidents have been at an all-time high. These incidents are taking place in K-12 schools, college campuses, on the street, on social media, and at Jewish institutions. These incidents include vandalism, harassment, assault, bomb threats on Jewish institutions, conspiracy theories, and tropes, among many other things. The Anti-Defamation League recently shared that education on the Holocaust instills more in students than facts and figures. In fact, ADL studies have shown that people whose school taught specifically about the Holocaust harbor less anti-Semitic prejudice than those who learned about the Holocaust elsewhere. To that end, individuals who have had education on the topic of the Holocaust also show higher rates of critical thinking and a greater willingness to challenge intolerant behavior. Collectively, this helps to build a better society. We are so grateful to individuals like Tony McAleer, who authored the book, The Cure for Hate, and is an international speaker striving to educate individuals, families, communities, law enforcement, and governments about the white supremacist movements. Tony co-founded the not-for-profit Life After Hate, an organization that helps people leave white supremacist movements behind, helping those who where he once was. In his youth and early childhood and early adulthood, Tony was the leader of one of the largest Canadian neo-Nazi skinhead organizations, ARM, or Aryan Resistance Movement, and an organizer for the White Aryan Resistance and Aryan Nations. He ran a computerized racist hotline that took him to the Supreme Court of Canada twice, was an articulate Holocaust denier, and built one of the first white supremacist websites for resistance records, helping to usher in the internet age. It was a long journey to turn his life around that was inspired by the birth of his daughter and then his son 15 months later. This journey took Tony through over 1,000 hours of individual and group counseling that has led to a very deep understanding of how people are drawn into these movements, as well as the road out to reconnect with their humanity and society at large. We are honored to have Tony here tonight. We are also honored to have Peter Hutchison, an award-winning filmmaker, New York Times bestselling author, educator, and activist. His most recent film, the critically acclaimed Healing from Hate, Battle for the Soul of a Nation, is now in wide release. The film examines the root causes of hate, group activity through the bold work of former skinheads and neo-Nazis, now engaged in de-radicalizing violent extremists and transforming attitudes of intolerance. Alongside Tony and Peter is 3G Philly board member Cindy Silverman. Cindy is the granddaughter of 2 Holocaust refugees who is dedicated to not only building community with other 3Gs, but she is also an educator who works tirelessly to help make our world a more tolerant and less hate-filled place. Thank you.
Thank you, Stacy, for the introduction, and thank you for all of you for being here tonight. We come together this evening to uphold the pledge of never again by educating ourselves and our communities on ways to combat anti-Semitism and other forms of hate. As we begin the program, we'll be monitoring the chat for your questions, and we'll be using those during the Q&A session of the program. I know we're all eagerly anticipating hearing from Tony and Peter. So without further ado, let's get started. So our first question for both Peter and Tony is, what brought you here? What made you want to do this work and make this film?
I think for me, it's part of an unfolding journey. You know, I don't think I set out an intention to be here, but here's where I find myself. You know, when I left that movement behind, it was really in 1998, it was really to take care of my children. That was the reason I left. And, you know, when I started the counseling work, it was really to enjoy more success in life and more abundance. But as I got into the depths of things, you know, it led me to want to co-found Life After Hate. It led me to the place where after working on myself, I wanted to help people where I once was. After spending 10 years there, the journey has again unfolded in a new way, and it's now about going back to the communities that I'd once harmed in the spirit of repair. And in the unfoldment of all of that, I had a trip to Auschwitz. This film was made, and ultimately, as I say many times in the film, this film is my tshuva.
It's sort of a way to atone for what you have done. Yeah. Peter?
Well, I want to thank all of you for having us here this evening. It's a real special way to bring so many people together to explore these issues. My pathway into this work is sort of a curious one. As a filmmaker and an activist, I've always been involved in social justice and human rights. But this film had a kind of a curious beginning. I was looking for the right way in to make a film about the crisis of masculinity in the United States. And I was working, collaborating with another author who said, you know, I haven't told anybody this yet, but I've been starting to interview and do research with this really fascinating group of men who have all spent years within the white supremacist movement and hate groups, and now are working together to help people exit hate groups and mainstream back into society. And that was my introduction to Tony. We bonded over the course of making that film, and there've been discussions of finding ways to go to Auschwitz to sort of continue the work and some of these men's journey. And when Tony suggested that we just simply go do it, I jumped at the chance. I think, you know, Tony has a particularly compelling story, and Tony's dedication to his own work and evolution, and being a vehicle to tell these stories and facilitate these kinds of conversations, I think it's a crucial thing.
And we so appreciate the work that you both brought here this evening, because it allows the lessons of the Holocaust and the lessons that Tony learned during his journey to be disseminated to a much wider audience for good. Okay, we have a short clip from the film that we're going to play.
What was unthinkable a generation ago is happening. The Holocaust is fading from memory. As we lose the last of the generation who survived the Holocaust, those that bore witness and lived to tell their story, we lose a vital link to one of the darkest chapters of human history. A stark reminder of what hate can lead to when left unchallenged. According to a recent survey, 41% of American adults and 66% of millennials cannot say what Auschwitz was. With over half unaware that Hitler came to power through democratic means, a lesson that Western democracies, perhaps now more than ever, cannot afford to forget. "20 years ago, I was a fervent neo-Nazi and Holocaust denier.
So what does all this say about Tony McAleer? How much of a threat is he?
I believe there are differences between the races. If that makes me a racist, then I'm a racist.
This is McAleer in 1990, inside the Aryan Nations compound in Hayden Lake, Idaho, headquarters of one of North America's biggest white supremacist groups. And it wasn't his first visit.
It's a life I've long left behind, but I continue to struggle with my role in contributing to such a dark legacy, and the shame I still carry. The violence and murder the white supremacist movement fantasized about all those years ago, the violence I once advocated and encouraged, have now become a horrific reality, as acts of racially motivated terrorism have increasingly become the norm. Somebody asked me once, "How did you lose your humanity?" "I didn't lose it," I replied. "I traded it for acceptance and approval until there was nothing left." In the Jewish tradition, tshuva means return, and describes the return to God and our fellow human beings that's made possible through repentance for our wrongs. Auschwitz has always loomed as a symbol for the legacy of the ideology I once espoused, and the fear that I may never fully atone for the damage I've done to the community I've harmed the most, the Jewish community. It was in that spirit that I traveled to Auschwitz, to bear witness to the unspeakable atrocities committed there, as a long overdue act of personal atonement, and in hopes of preventing others from following in my path. The inescapable truth is that white supremacist ideology, if left unchecked, always ends in murder, and we ignore the lessons of history at our own peril.
I can tell you, I watched this film several times because the first time I watched it, it was overwhelming. The second time I watched it, it was overwhelming. And the third time I watched it, it was overwhelming. But each time I was able to get a little bit more and a little bit more. And I know the story, right? I know what happened there. And so I have to ask you, why was it important for you to go there and to film it?
I think for me, it was, again, as the unfolding of my journey, it was something that I felt I needed to do. And I remember having a conversation with the folks at the Museum of Tolerance, and one of them was saying, the stories of formers, that's what young people are interested in the most, right? And whenever we get bring a former in to speak, the young people are just captivated. And I thought, what if we can use my story, as a foundation, as a platform, to tell the story of Auschwitz in a way that makes it more relevant to young people today. Because as we talk in the film, the amount of young people that don't really understand and know the history, and as the last of the survivors pass on from this life, the fear is it becomes black and white footage in the before time that young people can't relate to. So in that vein, I felt it was important that we documented so that we could do something to make that history vitally relevant to young people in the context of today.
Yeah, seeing the images and hearing you speak about seeing the images, you really can feel that it was horrific. It was, in the context of what happened, it really took you over when you heard about the human hair and you saw the belongings. Peter, how easy was it to make the links between aspects of society in Nazi Germany and elements of our society now?
Well, I think Tony hit the nail on the head when he said, the goal and the trick here is how do you make the Holocaust living history? How do you help connect people to that, to what is, I think, for younger generations feeling like a black and white world several generations in our past that they have a hard time connecting with. And I think in order to do that, it was important to take a look at the conditions that the Third Reich and Nazi Germany rose out of. And once you start to do that, you don't get very far down that road without seeing all kinds of very, very direct parallels with what we've been seeing, not just in the United States the last several years, but around the world in terms of authoritarian tendencies. When things aren't great, when people are feeling disenfranchised, when people are struggling, when people don't have hope, when they don't have a lot of economic opportunity, there seems to be a default that people go to in terms of blaming and othering and unfortunately all too often embracing either authoritarian or totalitarian sort of political orientations. And I think that was kind of, this film for me operates on three different levels. One is Tony's personal story as this vehicle to help people understand how men get in and out of hate groups. The other is, how does the rise of the Third Reich, how does that mirror what's happening today? And the third is this piece of Holocaust history, which is not everyone has the opportunity to travel to Auschwitz. And it's an incredibly powerful experience, as anyone who has ever been there knows, that you cannot leave that place transformed. You can't do it. And there's something very powerful in bearing witness that I think comes through watching Tony in this film. And I think we wanted to try and provide the opportunity for the viewer to experience that, even if they can't personally travel to Auschwitz.
Yeah, I really appreciated weaving in Tony's story with the history, and certainly the rise of power of the Third Reich. It really made it quite powerful.
Well, and I think the fact that you viewed it, several times, to me speaks to us being successful in trying to pack as much as we did in there. So thank you for your kind words.
I was just going to say, I think one of the real tricks, and it really speaks to the skill of Peter and Lucas, the editor, and the art of making films. And it's a very fine line between making a film that's about me, and we try not to make it about me because Auschwitz is the bigger story. The historical to the present context is a bigger story. How to make it about me without it being about me. It's that fine line, which I think Peter pulls off. And for me, the sort of three elements of the film, it's education, it's about prevention, and it's also about repair. And those are the three pieces as I see them, but which are very similar to what Peter spoke of.
Yeah, I very much appreciated your story weaved, through the story of the Third Reich and the Holocaust, because it made it feel like this could happen to anybody. It made it human. Many of those people you don't hear from, they're not alive. They wouldn't speak. So you as a person saying, I could have been here easily, was very powerful. Tony, do you feel like youth today are struggling with the same issues that led you to become a neo-Nazi, or do you feel like the landscape has changed?
I think the issues of identity and belonging that young people struggle with are age old. I think it's in many ways it's part of the human condition. But where they can end up in that struggle with technology is certainly, I think the technology is very much different, and it's one part of it is what they have access to on the internet. That's a challenge, but it's also what on the internet has access to them, which is equally challenging. But that need to belong and what people will do in order to belong, and what they will submerge of themselves and hide of themselves and suppress of themselves in order to fit in. That's an age-old problem, and I think we need to focus as much on that side of things for young people, because there's a whole host of places where young people end up in that quest to belong, to fit in,
Right.
To be perceived as normal.
And some of us, I think, forget in adulthood, and maybe it's because we choose to forget how difficult it is being an adolescent. I mean, when we speak, when we engage with schools, and when we're talking with students, we'll often ask, has anybody out there ever felt insecure and like you didn't fit in anywhere? And invariably, every single hand in that room will go up. I mean, it is part of the adolescent condition. And so I think Tony's 110% on the mark here, that it has to do with identity and belonging, and for better or worse, in the fast-paced, technologically driven society we live in now, some of that can be really just speeded up.
Yeah, I think we're all communal human beings, for sure. What do you both hope to accomplish with your educational programming?
You want to take that, Peter?
Sure. I think It's a great question. That's an extension, I think, of what we already discussed. I think Tony's story provides such a wonderful container and opportunity for not just young people, but everybody to think about identity and how identity plays into this process. And a lot of the work that we do with students when we, I'm not sure how many of you are aware that how our program is for secondary school students is broken down into smaller components that have specific thematic material. And so we can drill down specifically into some of these issues and do sort of long form classroom workshop stuff around them. But at least for the secondary school students, it's finding ways for young people to think about identity and to think about this tool we call the 3 C's, which is using compassion, curiosity, and courage in your everyday life. How can you approach situations around you in a courageous way, stepping outside of your comfort zone? How can you be genuinely curious about other people's beliefs, backgrounds, where they come from? Not just listen, but actually be curious and engage. And of course, compassion is sort of the ground of being for all of this, right? How can we learn how to be compassionate, towards ourselves and other human beings as well? Obviously, there's also the more sort of linear, conventional Holocaust education and pieces and educating people around the history, which is crucial. But tying that into more modern contemporary history, those things are very important threads, I think, for us that I want people to be able to take away from the project.
I think it's a great complement to other forms of Holocaust education for sure. And I like the lessons because it speaks to, we have a lot of polarization right now particularly in our country, and nobody's willing to hear the other person or listen or understand their perspective. And this sounds like it allows for people to explore that and the differences in people without being so polarized. It's not black or white. There's a lot of gray.
100%. And also the process of dehumanization that is intrinsic to be able to consider someone else as other and to polarize to that extreme. I think that's something that Tony talks a lot about over the course of the film. And I think it's difficult to not watch this film beginning to end and not have a very keen understanding of that process.
I think adults can learn from that as well, for sure, right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
The role models. Okay, we have some questions from.
I should mention that this film isn't necessarily geared towards high school students, but our outreach and impact program is. We are, it's our goal to engage entire communities around these conversations. But the reason why our program is targeting 9th and 10th graders is that that's the age where identity is really in flux, and that's also the age in many cultures where indoctrination and recruitment happens with hate groups.
So it sounds like from that description that you are not only bringing this program and film to schools, but also to communities to engage in the conversation.
100%. I think we're trying to create a more holistic approach to driving and facilitating these sorts of conversations. Wherever we go and do a school engagement, we're also doing either a festival or community engagement. We're bringing the film into houses of worship, community centers, colleges. The goal is, and I was really, really pleased to hear this after we were in Pittsburgh a couple of weeks ago. is someone actually wrote us and said the most wonderful outcome of this is that, like, on our car ride home and at our dinner table, our family, even though we had seen different screenings, had very in-depth and engaged conversations around this stuff. And that's what we're hoping for. That's what we're looking for.
Us too. Okay, we have some questions. We have a question from Sean. He says, I've been teaching courses on the Holocaust for 15 years and see people in those groups that have children indoctrinate their children into the group. Was there a specific incident that happened beyond the birth of your first child, Tony, that made you realize what you were doing was wrong and didn't want your children to be part of that world?
Certainly the environment that I found myself in with my young children in and around that movement was highly toxic. I must say that, beyond the ideals that people espoused of the sort of ideal noble way of living, nobody I knew lived like that. Every relationship that I knew of was dysfunctional and toxic and had either verbal, emotional, or physical abuse in it. So it was not a place I wanted to bring up my children. If I thought of my children growing up and being in relationships with that, not a chance. But really, what the birth of my children sparked, was not like a road to Damascus moment. It started a process and a heart thawing, because children are, they're infectious with their love. And for me, it was safe to let the guard down and to love them, to allow myself to feel and be in my heart, because up until then I was a complete narcissist. I completely cut myself off from my heart and from feeling. And so it began a thawing process, and raising them as a single parent, being able to parent them the way I always wanted to be parented. I was the opposite of my dad, and they had all the time in the world with me, maybe not as good as a provider as he was, but that whole process. And when I found myself as a single father with two kids, I had to make some really tough decisions, because I had so much wrapped up in my identity of being part of that movement. But then I'm also the single father here, and these two children are suffering because of my involvement in the movement, socially, economically, the quality of their life and all of that stuff. So it was the beginning of the process where I started to think of and make decisions with someone other than myself in mind. And as I continued to do that, the easier that became, and it kind of, began a process. But the real deep work didn't start until I had a counselor that helped me deal with my childhood wounds, which were still spilling out all over my life, even after I'd left the movement.
I remember seeing part of your film where you mentioned your counselor said something of the effect of, that wasn't you, that was your actions. And he truly believed in you as an individual. And that was really, I think, an emotional time for you.
That was huge. What he said was, that's what you did. That's not who you are. I see you. I see little Tony. And he helped me reconnect to little Tony, who I came into the world to be, the core essence of who I am. And because when I was in that world, I couldn't have been more diametrically opposed to little Tony. The little Tony, if I think about who you are at the age of 3 or 4. And I was this curious, mischievous, sensitive, open to the world, little stubborn, little defiant little guy. And, along the road, we learn it's not safe to be those things. And we put on masks in order to feel loved. And we put on armor in order to avoid pain. And that, remained the core of who I was, but who I was living at that time was completely the opposite of that. And, it was, and being in that position was the exact opposite of being in flow. But life was like swimming upstream. It was difficult. The more I've learned to live in alignment and integrity with little Tony, to connect with little Tony, the more my life comes into flow. And it's what's a really interesting exercise. And Dov, took me on that journey too. And that's part of the journey of self-acceptance, self-compassion, having compassion for little Tony. And as I could build that compassion for self and recognize the humanity within me, I could recognize it within other people. And the more I could recognize it within other people, the more I could recognize it myself. And it became this positive feedback loop of compassion and humanization for others.
I think it's amazing how one statement took you to a whole other world. And it just speaks to how important people are to other people and what they say matters.
Absolutely. I can't tell you the number of times someone's come up to me at an event or just in the street, and they said, you said this thing like 5 years ago, and it changed my life. Like my whole life took on another trajectory. And I'm sitting there going, I have no idea what I said. But what we do in every moment of every day and who we choose to be impacts the world around us in ways we can't see or imagine. So it's, getting back to the 3 C's, it's important to be conscious of that and choose courage, curiosity, compassion, to choose good in all of our actions and resist judgment, resist dehumanization, resist fear and that.
Words matter. We have a question from Hagit for Tony. What kind of reactions, interactions from others during your hateful years has de-escalated your hate or rage towards Jewish people? And then there's a second part. What suggestions do you have for people facing attacks and Jew hatred to respond in the moment to calm the angry attacker?
That's a very complicated question. I mean, you always have to take your safety and security into account. And when I think of the angry skinhead with the swastika, in my mind, I see a wounded 2-year-old having a temper tantrum in a grown man's body. And certainly that's what I was. And as disarming as that sounds, I'm also very cognizant of the fact that there's probably nothing more dangerous than a wounded 2-year-old having a temper tantrum in a grown man's body. So it's, we must also take that into account either. But I believe, hurt people hurt people. And I've seen incredible things happen through compassion, diffusing situations, but that's not an approach that's appropriate for everybody. It's not an approach that's appropriate all of the time. You really have to take judgment. Sometimes you have to physically secure your safety. I mean, there's no escaping that. In society, it's important to have compassion, but it's also important to have healthy boundaries and consequences. And when the two come together, they're a truly powerful thing. And for me, the compassion of my counselor, who I didn't know it at the time, who was Jewish, he certainly let me know it at a certain time, was profoundly impactful for me. But I'm not suggesting that it's the responsibility of Jewish people or people of color or marginalized communities to take on that role of being compassionate. It was perfectly in alignment with where Dov was at with compassion, to have that compassion. So it's a complicated, there's no one answer fits all, but I think when we respond to the world with love and compassion and hold healthy boundaries and consequences, we take some of the sting out of the hatred that's in the world. If we respond to it with more anger and hatred, we feed that.
If I can just piggyback on that quickly, even though I wasn't asked the question. One of the things when we talk about the 3 C's, which I think is absolutely crucial, is the C of curiosity, which is asking people, genuinely asking people, and being curious about why they feel the way they feel or why they believe the things that they believe. And oftentimes when people have an opportunity to sit down and discuss those things openly, that's often your opportunity to help them understand the flawed logic or where maybe emotionally their responses are coming from. And I think, Tony, I think you've had all kinds of experiences with that in terms of having that opportunity to speak openly with people and question, these assumptions or question their beliefs. And I think there's nothing more powerful than being able to honestly get to know someone who comes from a group that you have been intolerant towards, or you don't fully understand. That's one of the things that Life After Hate used to do, is bring people together from different communities so that they could understand one another. I mean, it's easy to hate somebody that you don't know, that comes from a different culture or community than yours. But when you know them, that's a completely different dynamic.
Yeah, and I think we tend to be creatures of staying with like-minded people, and we don't necessarily engage with people outside of our communities. So I think that's a great point that you make, is to maybe be involved in community activities where you may not be with those like-minded people, but get to know people on a different level.
I just would say real quick, in the film Peter did, Healing from Hate, that's on Prime. There's a scene towards the end of that film where you can actually see this play out on camera, with Randy and what was the other guy's name?
Julius.
Yeah. And Randy's a skinhead. He's wearing swastikas on his shirt. He's going to see Richard Spencer in Florida, and there's this crowd he's walking through that are protesting, and they're punching him and kicking him and spitting on him. And Julius is this incredible young Black man who pulls him aside and has a conversation with him. I won't say anything more than that. Go watch the film. It's on Prime. It's I don't want to spoil the moment, because to me it's the most powerful part of the film. But you can sort of see how it plays out, and it's a remarkable thing to watch.
What a lot of formers kind of echo, and you've had your own experience like this with Dov, is this concept of receiving compassion from someone who you deserve it from least when you need it the most. And there's all of these different examples in that film in particular of formers who, when they were active in the movement, received compassion from, someone who was Jewish, or someone who was Muslim, and it completely flipped their entire worldview around, because they saw the humanity in one another, and it changed their entire outlook.
Peter, you've dedicated your filmmaking career to making films with social impact themes. What role do you think film and media can play in society?
Well, it's interesting, because if you asked this story 10 or 15 years ago, the answer would be different than it is today. And I have a 13-year-old, I have a teenager, and I am fully and quite sadly cognizant of the reality that he gets 90% of his information through film, through video, through different platforms online. Kids his age rarely pick up a book anymore. So storytelling and video, it is the medium now. And so I think it's indispensable in terms of storytelling, in terms of changing hearts and minds, in terms of education. There's no way around it. 10 or 15 years ago, you could make a different argument, but unfortunately, I don't see it anymore.
Right. What is your filmmaking process like, and how do you identify a story that you want to tell?
That's a great question.
Hmm?
Wow, I don't know how to answer that. A lot of different things have to come together. Sometimes it's kismet, it has to be something you're really interested and passionate about, because I've had this conversation with other filmmakers. The average time it takes from conception to completion of a film, a documentary, is 7 years. I've been lucky to get them done in 2 years. But regardless, you're gonna spend a hell of a lot of time, completely immersed in that subject matter. So you better really be passionate about it and care about it and believe in it, and believe that it's a story that is worth telling, and that there will be value in others from.
And a lot of your documentaries have had very similar themes in terms of males, correct? Masculinity.
That's very insightful. Yes. It's a recurring theme in my work, I think, is questions around masculinity in America and identity. Yeah, and how that plays out in different milieux, whether that's social, political, economic, even sports.
We have a question from Brooke for Tony. At a recent talk, a student asked me, Brooke, what I would say to a Holocaust denier. I'm curious to know how you would answer that question.
That's a very, very good question. There's a couple different tacks to take of what I would say to a Holocaust denier. Because keep in mind that Holocaust deniers don't say nothing happened. They just question how much happened and whether certain things happened, right? So I was taught that, it was typhoid, it was starvation, it was other reasons why people had died. And so, one of the things where I've got to now is, one is too many, whether it's arguing whether it's 6 million or 4 million or 3 million or 2 million is a ludicrous argument, because one is too many. One of the things that I believed the most was the mathematical argument. There's so many crematories at Auschwitz. There was so many people that were supposed to be cremated, and the amount of time that there was, there's a mathematical argument that the numbers don't add up. But what those numbers don't take into account, because I remember when I was 20, I called up the cemetery in Vancouver and I said, how long does it take to do a cremation? They said 3 hours, right? And so I did the math. It's like, yes, it doesn't add up. What they don't tell you is they cremate the coffin. What they don't tell you is sometimes there's multiple bodies being cremated in Auschwitz, or that they're not full cremations. And when you take those other things into account, the math does make sense. And so there's some various obvious fallacies in their arguments that are very, very easy to puncture because they're not taking anything into account. And then the other side of the equation is whether you're arguing about 6, 5, 4, 3, like it's an insane argument to be having, because one is too many. And so those are the two sort of main angles that I would approach.
So it's, people are distorting facts.
Absolutely. And
their own purpose.
Yeah. So and there's one thing to go, well, I know they're cremating the coffin and they're not, over here. It's another thing if people can get sucked into it because they don't know they're ignorant of all of the facts, and they're playing around with a limited set of facts that suits their purpose or suits the purposes of people sharing them, who are giving them the information to begin with. So there's some malevolence taking advantage of ignorance at play.
And I think we see that today as well, right? In the news.
No question. There's, Nick Fuentes, who he was the one that sat down with Trump at Mar-a-Lago with Nick Fuentes and Kanye. Nick Fuentes became infamous before he talked about Holocaust denial in code words, and he talked about the Cookie Monster, and the Cookie Monster has so many ovens, and the Cookie Monster wants to cook so many cookies. How many cookies can he cook in a 24-hour period? And he was talking about cookies as human bodies in code. That video was viewed millions of times. And so those arguments still absolutely exist today, and they're predicated on the same faulty information and on the same ignorance, and in his case, I'd say malevolence.
Right. We have a comment from Julie. She says, I worked on a project with Derek Black a number of years ago, who also grew up in the movement and renounced the neo-Nazi KKK. And she just wanted you to know that she had a lot of respect for you.
Thank you.
We have a question from Eileen. Will the film be available via your agency after tonight's program?
Well, I guess that's a question. It depends on what capacity you're asking it'll be available. We are bringing the film into communities this fall across the United States. They are select communities, but we are constantly looking for partnerships around the film. So our program, Brett, will bring the film into certain communities, colleges, high schools. It won't be available in terms of broad distribution in 2023, though. It'll be purely through this outreach program that we have and film festivals. But if you follow us on the social media stuff, you'll be kept in the loop about what's happening.
And if someone wanted to bring your program to their community or classroom, how would they go about that?
Reach out and contact us at impact@thecureforhatefilm.com. impact@thecureforhatefilm.com. Is that right, Tony? Sounds right, right?
Yes.
Yes. There it is right there in the chat. Thank you, Megan. And we can see whether we might be coming into a community near yours and be able to include you in that, or whether if there was a robust enough interest in bringing the program into your community, we might be able to set the time aside to bring that in and make a sort of a broader impact in the community. I mean, in the long run for us, the goal is to create a program that is self-sustaining, evergreen, and that will be free for any secondary school use. And I think it's Tony and my hope to go out on a college film tour next year with this.
So not just high schools, you're going to be hitting colleges as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, this is just as much, if not more of an issue on colleges these days, with its own set of complicated variables and factors and issues. I mean, I've never seen polarization on college campuses as it is now since maybe the Vietnam War, right?
Tony, are there any specific moments or examples of when you felt like, wow, I'm really making a difference? My work is really making a difference.
Yeah, and the story I'm going to share with you is was from Tennessee when we did a community screening, and it was afterwards, and it was in my book. I talked about, because there was a number of LGBT students in the crowd. So I talked about the gay bashing I participated in when I was 17. And I talked about, as part of my working with Dov later on, did the speaker training, leadership training with him. And one of the questions he asked us is, think of the most shameful thing that you've ever done. And instantly that event popped into my mind. And then the next thing he did was get up on stage in front of the class and act it out. And so I had to go and act out what we did to this young man. And I couldn't do it and feel it, right? So he said, "No, do it again, do it again." I had to do it for about 2 hours, over and over and over again, till I could connect to it, till I could feel the weight of it. I had to act it out as the victim. And it was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do, because I had all these people watching me, and here I am, acting out the most shameful thing I've ever done. And I remember at a friend's St. Patrick's Day party about 2 weeks later, and he introduced me to his 4 gay friends. And so I pulled them aside into a room, and I told them what I had done. And I said, "Look, I know I didn't do it to you, but somebody else did. I know I didn't do it to you, but I did it to your community. Can you forgive me?" And 3 of them broke down crying. One of them, couldn't. I was crying, they're crying, we hugged, and 2 of them are still good friends of mine today. And in that moment, I realized how powerful an effect that what I'd done had on them. And at the end of the screening, after I told that, the last person to come up to me was this young woman, maybe about 20, and she's trembling. And she comes up to me, and she's can barely get the words out, and she said, "No one's ever said sorry to me before." And then she almost starts crying. She says, "I'm gay," and just starts bawling. I said, "There's a hug here if you want it." And then she wanted a hug, and I gave her a hug for a couple of minutes, and said to her, "Whatever happened to you, I'm sorry." But she was so deeply moved, even though it wasn't something I had done to her, but somebody obviously had, and nobody was going to say sorry to her. I was crying, and Cynthia, who was the co-host, she was crying, and Cynthia, she used to run the Matthew Shepard Foundation and is gay herself, and she was like, "What did she say?" And I told her, and she said, wow, she's never going to forget that for the rest of her life. And I've had this happen over the last, even showing some people the trailer, that it's really touching people at a really deep emotional place. And I'm humbled by that I'm a vehicle by which that is happening, and that healing is happening, and these really special tearful moments are happening for people is humbling.
And maybe for the first time they feel seen by somebody who hurt their community or hurt them.
Absolutely. And whether they're gay or they're Jewish or East Indian or Black, it's I guarantee you there's stuff that's happened that nobody's apologized for, anti-Semitic stuff. And it's and like I said, I know I didn't do it to you specifically, but I did it to your community.
And I think we keep coming back to the theme: words matter, words matter, words matter, whether it's used positively or negatively. Words matter.
Yeah, I think, Cindy, you're absolutely right. Being seen is a tremendously powerful experience. And a lot of people don't feel seen. And that also feeds in with a lot of these issues that we talk about around identity all the time. They're very much intertwined, right?
We have a comment from Helen. She says, I love the film and feel it illustrates powerfully how our words and behavior comprise our identity. My sister is a professor at a community college who teaches film. She shows Casablanca and students are clueless about World War II and Nazi occupation, among other things. Since red states are removing critical race theory or Holocaust books, how can we teach students about the Holocaust?
Well, that's obviously a big issue these days. Tony and I were just down at the South by Southwest EDU conference a couple months ago, and went to numerous workshops around these issues. How do you talk about these really crucial issues with students at the time in their lives when they need it most, when acronyms like CRT or SEL raise red flags and end up creating obstacles for you to be able to engage, right? I think that's why when we look at how we're approaching bringing this out into communities, why we're taking a holistic look at it, and if we can't get into high schools, then we'll bring it into community centers. We'll bring it to universities where entire communities will be given, free access to it, particularly if you're from a high school. We're partnering with film festivals around the country to, when we bring the film into the festival, to help those festivals help us engage with communities wherever we go. Some of them even host special screenings to bring students in, and will even help provide transportation to bring the students into these special student focused screenings. So it takes work, partnership, flexibility, a lot of coordination, but we do believe in approaching things from a community standpoint, from a community perspective, and feel like there's a lot of different entrance ways. Even if schools themselves aren't necessarily open to a broad range of curriculum.
And believe it or not, a lot of red states that might block CRT actually have legislated state Holocaust education. Tennessee, Kentucky, I think even Florida.
And I think that's why we've really worked hard, at least with our impact programming, to meet communities where they're at. We're not going to communities to teach CRT or social emotional learning. That's not what we're doing. But we can still talk about history. We still talk about Holocaust education. We still talk about issues around identity and how things like those play into hate and belonging. So I think you need to be you just need to be creative about how you approach and engage and be limber about it.
Thank you. We have a question from Alana. It feels like people who are already a part of hate groups are not interested in hearing outside perspectives. Do you feel like it's more important to work proactively with young adolescents like you and Peter mentioned, or do you also work with members already indoctrinated?
Well, there's groups like Life After Hate, and there's other groups that have you come up in the wake of that work to get people out of hate groups. People that are in that space of indoctrination, though, often the first thing that we start with is not dealing with what they believe in their head. We meet them at a whole other level. We, of course, we deal with the ideology at the end of the day, but we have to meet people where they're at. And someone who's deeply entrenched in this space requires a different approach than simply students struggling with identity who are in their curiosity have found themselves down some rabbit holes. It's a whole other approach. Things like unconscious bias and having the wrong ideas in your head. Those things can be fixed through education. When people join, a violent militant extremist group and have a violent ideology where they don't see any problem in harming other people to fulfill their political aims, that's a whole other kettle of fish that education by itself usually can't deal with.
I'm going to ask a follow-up question to that, because I also watched Life After Hate, and it really struck me as to really how long it takes to deprogram people who have been indoctrinated into these organizations. And I'm not sure how or why people find that organization, or why all of a sudden they decide I want out. Maybe you could speak to that.
Sure, and I'm not sure deprogramming is the right word to use, because I don't think the problem is so much a problem of the mind as a problem of the heart. When we talk about winning hearts and minds, that there's so much emphasis in today's society in winning the mind, but really it's about dealing with the heart issues, the wound issues. Again, hurt people, and behind the people espousing that ideology is wounds, and it does take a long time to help people get out of that. And Life After Hate by itself, certainly there's no way it can scale to match the size of the problem. But what Life After Hate did do very well was provide proof of concept. And in communities all over the place, and even in schools, there's social workers and counselors that can easily be trained. It's not trained to learn a counseling method that's going to deal with. They already know the counseling method. They can be trained that the counseling method that they know can actually be used in this case. It's cultural competency training, because there's a vast amount of resources already in the community that already has the skill set to deal with this. They just don't think they have the skill set to deal with it. And that's how we make it scalable.
I think it's also important to remember that, and as you've seen in Healing from Hate, that the ideology is often secondary. The primary driver for what brings most of these young men, what attracts them to these hate groups, is this need for belonging, brotherhood, empowerment, a sense of place, a higher purpose. I think even Tony, you've talked about how the ideology for you kind of crept up on you. It's when you repeat something often enough, it slowly sneaks up on you until you've embraced that ideology. And so I think for a lot of people, when they leave the movement, and Tony can speak to this much better than me, obviously, but my experience from what I've seen in the passenger seat is that oftentimes when it's not the ideology that was keeping people in those groups to begin with, it's that these people have been, it's their community, it's their surrogate family, it's their friends, it's in some cases, it's their economic well-being. And when you walk away from a group like that, when you walk away from a hate group, you walk away from everything. And you're generally not walking back to some place that's going to welcome you with open arms on the other side of the fence. So, the sort of some of this language around things like deprogramming or whatever it is, I don't know if it's really as important as an issue as kind of what Tony's talking about as being an issue of the heart. It's our, it's someone's human connection, and walking away from that into the wasteland can be an incredibly difficult thing.
So what I hear you saying is when you start addressing the trauma, then the ideology just breaks down. That you don't necessarily have to address that head on.
Yeah, I mean, it's a simplistic way of saying it, but I think, yes, I think that that trauma is the foundation upon which and the lies we believe about ourselves because of the trauma is the foundation upon which that ideology takes root and takes hold. And when we can heal that, the ideology can be easily crumbled from there.
Right, and these obviously dysfunctional organizations are great places for dysfunctional people to go to, right? You're gonna be attracted to that sort of systems dynamic. And I forgot what else. I was going to say something else right on the tip of my tongue, and it's gone forever.
Okay. From Jennifer, she would like to know from Tony, what was the core of his Holocaust denial, given the amount of video, testimony, and legal trials that proved it happened? What is the core rhetoric that makes it possible for people to believe it didn't happen?
The mathematic thing that I said earlier was at the core of it for me. I mean, I met David Irving. I knew Ernst Zundel, been to his house many times, so I was steeped in the knowledge of that. And there's always, tenuous counter arguments, even if the court find it. I mean, it's no different than the court finding it one way and Trump saying, no, it's a witch hunt, it's fake news, it's this and that. We see what we want to see, and so that was, the courts were, run by Jews. It's a rigged system. I mean, we believe that there was this hive mind cabal of Jews that were controlling the world and entertainment and the legal system and the economy and the open door immigration, and everything sort of led back to that cabal. That was what we believed at the time. And what we believed also was that the sympathy generated by the Holocaust after World War II was the foundation for that power that they had. And if we could erode that sympathy, we could get rid of that, we could undermine the power that they had. If we could turn the people who felt sorry for Jews in the aftermath of World War II to replace that with anger at having been deceived by them in the aftermath of World War II, we could undermine the power that imagined BS. I don't believe that that imaginary cabal had, and that was sort of the underlying reasoning behind all of it, if that makes any sense. Well, I mean, it doesn't make sense, but in the context of the answer.
Right.
So I did remember, if you'll indulge me, where the train of thought I wanted to follow that with, which is, Cindy, you'd asked if healing shame and trauma is the sort of the solution for helping get people out of hate groups. And what I wanted to mention is that, it's actually addressing the shame and trauma that prevents young men from entering hate groups or finding them appealing in the first place, right? And so I think when we look at this as kind of through a more systemic lens, and we look at our society, we want to ask very simple questions around, why are we letting these young men fall through the cracks? Why, where are the mentors? Where are the fathers? Where are the opportunities for healing around this shame or trauma, which might help us create healthier, more whole young men who don't have these vulnerabilities that set them up for recruitment and indoctrination into these kinds of groups.
And if I could just follow that up with that, it does not discriminate among socioeconomic class. It is throughout any socioeconomic classes could happen.
That's absolutely true. Yes. Shame and trauma, no
Boundaries.
no boundaries in terms of that. That's absolutely true. Great point.
Question from Laura. Do either of you ever get called woke in a negative light? Do you have haters because of the work you do?
Well, I live in Brooklyn, New York, and I don't know how to say this without being a little catty about it. I couldn't be woke enough for Brooklyn. I never get accused of being woke. I think because sometimes I question some of the fundamental assumptions around what woke means and what we as a culture and a society want to get out of this really important conversation that we're having right now. I think I question the means by which we go about it some ways, sometimes. But you know, when you leave Brooklyn, the confines of the bubble of Brooklyn, and you find yourself in Florida or Arizona, I think, yeah, I probably would be in danger of being called woke.
Woke is in the eye of the beholder, right?
Yeah. I think you're right, Tony.
Question from Jen for Tony. Are you in contact with any of your former neo-Nazi friends? Have any of them opened up to hear your current views and contemplating changing their beliefs?
I'm only really in contact with the ones that are out of it and have grown up and moved beyond it. There's a handful of them. To be honest, a great number of them are dead. You know, it's funny. It's not funny, but it's peculiar that, you know, when we stop one expression of you know, shame, you know, which is the violence and the racism and being, you know, part of an extremist group. The two most common stories that I've heard people, the two pathways out, is one is, I can't tell you how many times I've heard that they've died of a drug overdose. So they, rather than externalize the shame, they leave the group, but without dealing with any of the underlying stuff, they internalize the shame and it leads them into the path of addiction. And then the other one is they find a more socially appropriate outlet for the violence and that projecting the shame onto others. And the number of people that I've heard, like, oh, he became an enforcer for a motorcycle gang. You know, they get involved in being enforcers in the criminal underworld. I heard that story a lot too. So even though they give the politics up, the path of destruction, whether it's destroying others or destroying themselves, remains intact until it's dealt with.
Because it goes right back to the trauma, right? Like dealing with the heart. Yeah. Tony, is the group you belong to still active?
No. I think Aryan Nations, I think, might still be, although the compound was bulldozed, I think, in 2003, 2004. They lost it in civil litigation. Tom Metzger, White Aryan Resistance, passed away, I think, 2-3 years ago, 4 years ago. So that organization is defunct. The skinhead organization I was involved with has long been defunct for 25 years. But these groups fall away, and then they pop up with a new face and a new name, but the same old story.
I think we have one more question, which is there a specific moment or two from your visit to Auschwitz that stood out as the most powerful?
The room with the hair. The room with, you know, and I sat in there and felt nausea. I felt disgust. I felt sick to my stomach. And I just sat in there for half an hour, and it echoed for me the next morning, because they gave us access to both camps for 3 hours before they were open. on the second day. So we was in Birkenau with Agnieszka before it opened, so there was nobody else around. And as I was taking in the scale of Birkenau, and the scale is mind blowing. Those same feelings of disgust, revulsion, nausea came back. But in the room with the hair, there was this external piece that was connecting to. When I was taking in of the scale of Birkenau and what had happened there, that those same feelings I connected to at an internal level. It was this disgust, revulsion, nausea at taking in what I had been involved with, what I had said, what I had done, what I had become a party to after the fact. And I'd gotten those things at a very intellectual level, easy enough. But at a really deep emotional level, it was a profoundly deep level that I got it towards me and what I had done. And I think those two experiences, once the externalized version of it and once the internalized version of it the next day at Birkenau, were profoundly deep for me.
I can only imagine the lasting impact to process it all lives on and goes on.
There's lots of other. I mean, it wasn't just those two moments. And I think one of the real stars of the film is Agnieszka, the guide. I spent 15 hours with her over 2 days, and she had obviously done an awful lot of internal work on herself, and her ability to hold space for me at certain times was incredibly skillful, and the ability of the editors to capture those moments as well in the pacing of the film, I think is really well done. But she knew sometimes when to say stuff, and then she knew sometimes when to just let me sit in it, in the feeling and the processing as I went through it. To me, she's the star of the film.
Well, I know I speak for all of us when I say thank you for sharing the lessons of your journey as an educational tool and helping to combat hate. And thank you to Peter for your creativity and talent in documenting Tony's journey in a moving and powerful way that demonstrates through education and compassion, there is hope. We've learned today that hate can be unlearned, and that it is up to us to take action and make a positive difference in the world. We can do this by challenging our own biases, speaking out against hate, and supporting organizations that are working towards a cure for hate. As we leave this event today, I urge you all to take action in your own way, whether it's through volunteering, donating, or simply being more aware of your own biases. Every small action can make a difference. As Nelson Mandela once said, no one is born hating another person because of the color of their skin or his background or his religion. People must learn to hate, and if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love. For love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposite. Let us all commit to being a force for love, understanding, and acceptance in our communities and beyond. And we thank you again for joining us today. And let us continue to work towards a world where hate has no place.
Thank you again to Cindy for introducing us to Peter and Tony and for creating this thought-provoking event. Thank you to Peter and Tony for your dedication in helping ensure that every student in the United States learns about the Holocaust, and for your tireless commitment to making our world a better place. While this event is free of charge, our 3G groups rely on donations. Please visit our web pages and donate whatever you are able so we can continue to offer programs and events like the one tonight. You can also learn more about our upcoming events and get involved in our work. To get more involved in the Impact campaign and bring the cure for hate to your school, please visit, as we mentioned, impact@thecureforhatefilm.com, We are also posting a post-screening survey in the chat, which we would appreciate you filling out. Together, let's ensure every student in the United States learns about the Holocaust, because today's learners may be the key to preventing tomorrow's tragedies. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us. It's been a really wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.